Now that we've defined the accessible attributes for the user and understood a little bit about how to create, update, and retrieve users, it's time to add some validations to this model. You may recall from the demo app that we added a validation to the micropost model that enforced a maximum length on the content of the micropost. Of course, we'll be doing that later on in this tutorial, but at this point we want to add some validations to the user model, and we'll start with validations for the presence of the name and email attributes. If someone comes to register for this site, they certainly should not be able to register without putting in a name and an email. So let's start with that. We'll begin with the validation for the presence of a name attribute. Rails provides a method called validates for this purpose, and we're going to give it an argument which is a symbol of the attribute that we want, which in this case is name. And in this case, we're going to say presence true. This will validate that a user actually has a name attribute. Let's see how this works. In order to reload the new model in the console, we have to use the reload bang method. Reload bang. And now let's see if we can create a user that doesn't have a name. So let's try user equals user.new, and let's just have an email. Now let's try user.save, and it says false. Now when you try to save a user with a model that has validations, Rails creates a list of error messages. It's a Ruby array of error messages, and so let's take a look at that. It's on user.errors.full_messages. And you see here that there is an error in this object that says name can't be blank. That's an indication that the validation is working. There's a second way to check to see if a user is valid, which is to call the valid question mark method on it. User.valid question mark. Remember, question mark methods are Boolean methods. They return true or false. In this case, user.valid question mark is false, and that's no surprise given that we just showed that the user wasn't valid. Finally, you may wonder what happens if we try to create an invalid user. Remember that the create method actually creates the user in the database, not just in memory. So let's try user.create. Okay, well in this case it returns an invalid user, but it doesn't indicate in any way that the user wasn't created. And we can tell by looking at the ID, for example, that it's nil. It wasn't created in the database. But there's another way to do this, and it's what I like to call a loud method, or sometimes a noisy method, which is to put a bang at the end of the create. Now remember that Ruby generally uses the bang character, or the exclamation point, like this, to indicate mutation. Remember that if you have an array, say A, and you call a.sort, that returns a sorted array, but it doesn't actually change the value of A itself. Whereas a.sortBang sorts the array and mutates the variable A and replaces it with the new value of the sorted array. In Rails, typically the bang method is used for a slightly different purpose. It's used to indicate that the method will raise an exception if it fails. So I'm going to hit return here and see if you can guess what might happen. So there's a bunch of error messages dumped to the screen. If you scroll up, you can see that it says active record, record invalid. So that's an exception. And it says validation failed, name can't be blank. So we're going to use this idea in our test. Now, you may recall that we're developing the sample app using test-driven development. And so for something like a validation, what we really want to do is add a failing test for the presence validation for the name attribute, and then write the application code, and then watch the test pass. So in this case, we've written the application code. This will sometimes happen. And of course, in this case, I did it mainly because validations are relatively new, and I wanted to show you how they work. But sometimes you will go ahead and write some application code and then realize that you actually want to write some tests. And in that case, it's a good idea to comment out the validation and then write the test code. So let's take a look at the actual test for this. So here's the test. We can take a look at where it is. It's in spec models userspec.rb. And you can see that there's this pending keyword. This is actually just a method defined by rspec. And it takes an argument that's a string. And you can see that in here there's just an interpolation of a special Ruby variable representing the current file. So let's take a look at what this does. In fact, let's run it. Let's do rspec spec models userspec.rb. This is what you'll do if you're not running Autotest. Or this is one of the things you can do if you're not running Autotest. And so you can see here that there's one example, 0 failures, 1 pending. Now I'm going to run Autotest again. And you can see in Autotest it's got 18 examples, 0 failures, 1 pending. And yellow is the color for pending specs, I'm sure, because we've got the red-green theme going with test-driven development, and this is like a traffic light. This is between red and green. We're yellow here. So now it's time to write our tests. And so I said test plural because I want to add a general test for the user model first, and then a specific test for the name presence validation. So let's start with it should create a new instance given a valid attribute. And now I'm going to use the createBang method we saw to raise an error if anything goes wrong. So I'm going to say user.createBang. And see if this works. Okay, now you might be surprised here. This should have worked because these are in fact valid attributes, and in fact they're valid even if the validation is implemented, but we've commented out the validation. What happened here is that even though everything is working fine in the console, there's a test database that needs to be prepared for running the test. Currently the test database does not know about the data model, so we need to fix that first. Let's open up a new tab. And remember that in order to change the data model, in general, we do rake db migrate. That actually changes the development database. We can do ls db development. So there's the development database. What we need to do now is rake db :test :prepare. And usually when people read these, they just omit the colon. Rake db test prepare. All right, so that updated the test database. Now if we rerun Autotest, it should work. And there we go, 18 examples, 0 failures. And now let's make a test for the name presence validation. It should require a name. So we'll say, let's say no name user equals user.new. So we'll give it an email, but not a name. And then we want to say that the no name user should not be valid. And the way to do that in rspec is as follows. So I'm going to type no escape and TextMate to complete. No name user dot should not be underscore valid. And so now we've got our failing test. So this is rspec code for a negative condition. We've seen this briefly before. The no-name user should not now be underscore valid. What this does in rspec when you have b underscore and then something is call the Boolean version of this, whatever this word is, on this object. So in this case, what it's doing is calling valid question mark on no-name user. And we just saw that that's the way you test to see if a user object is valid without actually trying to save it. So now that we've got our failing test, let's go back to the application code and uncomment the validation. Uncomment it, and now save it and see if we're green. There we go, 2 examples, and they're both green. Let's rerun the whole test suite, Control-C. There we go, 19 examples, 0 failures. And at this point, we should add an analogous validation for the email attribute, because emails should also be present. So let's look at our test. Remember, this is test-driven development. We're going to write a test first. It should require an email. address. And let's say no email user equals user.new. So the test is almost exactly the same, and as before, we get to red. Now let's add the validation. You can probably guess, based on this model, what the validation is. Validates email, presence true. And I'd like to put an extra space in here just so the vertical parts line up, so this looks nice. And now if I save this, we should be back to green. And there we go. So now the email is being validated just the way the name is. Now before we leave the presence validations, there's one little thing I want to do. You'll note that we're repeating some things here. We've typed out the email address here a couple times. We've typed out the example user's name a couple times. There's a way to eliminate this sort of duplication by putting a before each block at the top, which will allow us to create an attributes instance variable that will then be available in every one of these tests. In order to use it properly, though, we're going to need to know about a method on hashes called merge. So let me show you that first. So suppose you got an attributes hash. Let's call it attr. So here's our attributes hash. Suppose that you wanted an attributes hash that actually had the empty string as the name, which is what you would get if you submitted an empty text field in a web form. You can notice over here, we actually just omitted the name. And that's okay. In this case, name is nil, and that's not valid. But this is actually a better simulation of what will really happen in a web application. So what we want is an attributes hash that has an empty string where the name is. And the way we can arrange for that is to use merge. So the attributes hash dot merge, and then when you call the merge method on a hash, what will happen is it will merge in the hash in the argument here. So let's do name is the empty string. So you can see here that it uses the same email key value pair, but it's overridden the name attribute with just the empty string. By the way, you can probably guess that this did not change the attribute variable itself. See if you can guess how you can actually mutate that attribute variable. That's right, there's a bang method. Merge bang will actually mutate it. But in this case, we don't actually need merge. We don't actually need merge bang. We just need merge itself. So let's define an attribute variable before each block. It has to be an instance variable in this case with an @ sign. So @attr. And we can actually copy and paste it. Let's just do that. And now you can see in this line, we can just replace this with @attr. Let's save it. This is now refactoring a test, so it's nice to see that the test suite will still pass. That's good. And in this case, we want it to keep the email address. What we want to do here is @attr.merge, and then have it be a blank name or an empty name. Good. And here, let's do @attr.merge email is empty. Or there we go. And we're still green. The next validation we're going to add is related to the demo app's sample validation, where we put a length limit on content. In this case, we want to put some sort of upper bound on the length of a user's name. And so let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to make a pending spec here. Check this out. It's pretty cool. It should reject names that are too long. I'm going to save this, and you'll see that it will actually make a pending spec. If you omit the do end part of the of this little it example, it automatically creates a pending spec. And that's really nice. Sometimes you want to make some specs and without thinking about what the implementation is. This is just a placeholder. It reminds you that you want to do this later. In this case, let's take a look at how to make a string that's really long. We're going to want some sort of way to make a long string. We could type it out, but there's a nice Ruby way to do it. It's what's called string multiplication. So let's take a look at that. Just for convenience, let's say that the upper bound on the length of a name will be 50. Somewhat arbitrary, but we have to pick something. So what we are going to want in this length validation is a string that's 1 greater than that. That is to say, that's of length 51. So let's see how that works. S equals, this is just a string variable, A, here's the letter A for no particular reason, just because it's the first letter in the alphabet, times 51. And so you can see that this is, well, it's probably 51 long. Let's take a look. S.length, indeed, it's 51 characters long. So this gives us the tool we need to create a name that's too long. Let's go down here. Let's create a local variable inside this it block called long name, long underscore name. And let's just do the same thing we did before. And now what we want is a validation that says that this is too long. You can see here we've used this this nice merge method again. Now long name user should not be valid. Of course, currently it is valid, which is a problem, so that's why we're red. Now let's go back to our application code. We already have a validation here for the presence of a name. The way to add a validation is just to add an extra part to this hash. Let's see, this is an options hash that it's at the end. Since it's the last argument, we don't need the curly braces, but we can keep adding key value pairs. In this case, we're going to add a length validation. I'm going to line these up. And in this case, the length validation itself takes another hash, which is maximum is the key, and then the value is 50 in this case. If we save it, then we should get to green. And there we go. Let's just quickly connect this to the demo app. Let's open up a new terminal here. And let's take a look at the, well, let's remember it's in app models micropost.rb. So just compare this with this. You can see that the content, this validates the content, length maximum 140. This validates the name, and it's the same syntax. Length is a maximum of 50. And the only difference is that here we also have a presence validation. Now, so far these validations have been pretty obvious, or at least the presence validations are obvious. Any web application that takes in a name and an email will typically want those things to be non-blank. And having a maximum length is a good practice as well. But of course, emails are not some sort of general string. We really should have some way of validating that the email matches the right kind of pattern for an email address. We also want to make sure that the email addresses are unique, since we plan to use them as the unique user sign-in. They're essentially the username will be the same as the email address. So let's tackle the format validation first. As usual, we'll write a test first. So we need a test that has some invalid email addresses. I'm going to show you a trick for making these conveniently. Now, you may remember that there's a way of making an array of strings. It's %w. And then you can actually use parentheses here, but I like to use square brackets because arrays have square brackets. So I can do foo bar baz, and that's an array of strings, foo bar baz. This is convenient because you don't have to keep typing quotations and commas. So the reason I showed you this is because we're going to define a variable of addresses. These are email addresses. In particular, these are valid email addresses. So say user@foo.com. An email address with all caps. That should work. I'm going to do foo.bar.org. We want to be able to support these sort of compound domains. And then let's say first.last at foo. Let's use a Japanese email address, JP. So these are the kinds of email addresses that we expect our format validation to accept as valid. And remember that since this is an array, it's enumerable, which means we can iterate through it with the each method, addresses.each. Do address. And let's just put it out. Put s address. See if you can guess what this will do. There it does. So it returns it returns this value that we don't really care about, this guy. But its main purpose here is to output these email addresses. So what we're going to do in the test is we're going to iterate through a bunch of valid email addresses and make sure that, in fact, the user created using that email address is valid. So let's look back at the user spec. It should accept valid email addresses. And let's just use the same one here. Now let's say addresses.each. Do address. And now I'm going to make a user with a valid email. So valid email user. So now we're going to use the merge method to set the email address equal to the address from the block. And then this valid email user dot should be valid. Now you'll notice that what happened here is that we're actually green. Now it's hard to write a failing test for this because these email addresses are in fact valid by construction. We haven't put any validations on email except for presence. What this will do is it will debug our format validation. We're going to be using a regular expression, as you may have guessed already, and regular expressions are notoriously error-prone. So it's nice to have a list of valid email addresses to make sure that the regular expression isn't too crazy. But of course, we also want a test for invalid email addresses. So let's do that now. It should reject invalid email addresses. Let's go up here and copy this and think of some of the things that can go wrong in an email address. So this one is a common typo. Let's have a comma, foo, comma, com. And let's say user@foo.org. Let's do example.user at foo. So these are some plausible invalid email addresses. Of course, it's hard to be completely thorough, but this is at least a sanity check. And now we want to do addresses.each, do address, invalid email user equals user.new, so this user should not be valid. And now we're to red, because currently these email addresses are valid since all we're doing is making sure that they're present. And so at this point we are in our red state and we're ready to go green. Now we've seen regular expressions a little bit before in this tutorial, but this is by far the most complicated one we will have dealt with. And as before, an invaluable tool for investigating regular expressions and building them up is the awesome website Rubular. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at Rubular and learning a little more about regular expressions. Let's start by putting in some test strings. You can use the same ones. Let's use these guys. And just for clarity, let's put them on their own lines. And let's put in the invalid ones too. What we want is a regular expression that will match all of the valid email addresses but won't match the invalid ones. Now, doing this sort of regular expression matching for email is somewhat tricky, and if you look out on the web, you'll find all kinds of different examples for how to do this. At some point, there might be some sort of standard Rails module for doing these sorts of validations. There might even be one right now, I'm not sure. But in any case, this is a really valuable exercise because it will give you a chance to understand a quite complicated regular expression. I always like to be in control of my email validations. It's impossible to be absolutely 100% correct in general without using some crazy official regular expression. But this will be good enough for pretty much any usage you would find on the web. So let's look down here at the regex quick reference. Oftentimes this is pronounced regex. This is short for regular expression. And what we want to do is build up a regular expression that will match the valid email addresses but won't match the invalid ones. Let's see how we might do that. Well, think about what an email address looks like. It's a bunch of characters, and then there's an @ sign, and then it's something dot something else. Well, that's not the general form, but we can start off with that. That's a good beginning regular expression. So let's take a look at this here, \w. \w matches any word character, which is a letter, number, or underscore. And if you look over here, you can see that the plus operator, a plus, is one or more of a. So we can match one or more word characters with \w plus. Let's try that. \w plus. Part of what's cool about Rubular is it shows you the match result over here. Now, in email addresses, it's \w plus and then an @ sign. And then we want to match something like a string of characters. So if you look down here, there's a way to match any single character in the range A through Z, and then we can combine that with this the plus operator, which is one or more of A. So we can match one or more of a single character in the range A through Z. Let's do that. So A through Z plus. And so now we've matched things like user @ foo. And now we want a dot. This is a literal dot. Now, if you look down here at the regex quick reference, the dot has a special meaning in regular expressions. It refers to any single character. So in order to get a literal dot, we need to escape it with a \, dot. So as you can see over here in the match result that we're now matching the dot here. And then we want something like the com or org or jp. And I prefer to be a little bit permissive here. It's okay to accept the occasional invalid email address. I think it's worse to reject one that's valid. So let's just match any sequence of characters here. Now you might notice that we're matching user@foo.com here, but we're not matching the user@foo.bard.org. And we can fix that by allowing this first part of the expression to have a dot in it. And now this is sort of confusing because you have to escape out the dot explicitly, except inside these square brackets where a dot has this literal meaning. So we can just put a dot in here. And now you might also notice that we're not matching the first dot last at foo.jp. That's because in this front part where we're only matching word characters, we really should add in a dot. And again, inside the square brackets, the dot is just itself. It's literal. Now we're now matching the three test strings that we want, and we're not matching the three that are invalid. But there are a few more valid email addresses out there. So, for example, an email address can have a plus character in this first part. So, for example, if you do username plus PayPal@gmail.com, that will route to username@gmail.com. But this way you can filter it on the name of the website where you've used it. You can also use hyphens in email addresses, and so this is one of those cases where a hyphen inside these square brackets is this range operator. So You don't have to escape out dots, but you do have to escape out a hyphen. So here we go, \hyphen. So these are some of the other things that can be matched in an email address. If you want to be extremely thorough, you can add in some strings. So we could do something like this. Just make sure that that matches. It does. And we could do user-name at email.com, and so on. There's also more that you can match inside this first part, this A through Z dot. You can also have numbers in the first part of an email address. So you can have something like foobar at 3com.com. That's valid, but right now we're not matching that. Let's put in any digit. So let's look down here. We can see that \d is any digit. So if we put this in here, we can do \d, and now we're matching foobar at 3com.com. And it's also valid to use something like this, foobar at foo-bar.com. I mean, this can, anything that is a valid domain name is a valid email. So let's put in another hyphen. Remember, we have to escape it. Actually, let's keep the same ordering. So do the hyphen and then the dot. Now you'll notice that this is a rather complicated regular expression, but because we built it up piece by piece, it was rather tractable at each stage. This is one of the reasons that I find Rubular so helpful. The markup system I used to write the Ruby on Rails tutorial book, which I call Polytechnic, has lots of regular expressions. They're very complicated in places, and I can't imagine having been able to write this piece of software without Rubular or something equivalent. Now, there's one tiny detail that I want to put in here, which is to take into account that email addresses are case insensitive. So you can see down here, at the very bottom, there are some options: case insensitive, match, make dot match new lines, and so on. And so I is the way to make this case insensitive, and you put it in this this box after the regular expression I. Now at this point, we're ready to do our format validation. Let's just copy this. And let's go to the user model. The way to do a format validation is simple. You just use the key as format, and then you say with, and then the value of the regular expression. So I'm going to call it email regex, and then I'm going to define a local variable, which is the regular expression that we had. So I just copied it in. But regular expressions need to be in the slash characters, like this. And then, remember, we saw that we had /i, so I'm going to put I at the end for case insensitive. Now, there are a couple of little details I want to put in. I actually want to match the beginning of the line and the end of the line. So if you go back to this regular expression editor, actually, we're green. You can see we're green. Autotest has already run. But if you look at this regex quick reference, you'll see that there's a way to match the start of the string. I actually said start of line and end of line. For this, you actually want to match the start of the string and the end of the string. So that's \a and \z. This is the kind of detail that will probably never matter. And I'm actually not sure how to test for this. It's pretty tricky. But based on my past experience with email regexes, I found this to be a prudent choice. So \a and \z. And now if we save it, it should still work. It should still be green. So there we go. So we've gotten a validation test written now for the format of an email. If you want to add in some extra valid or invalid email addresses, that's fine. But my experience is that this validation works pretty well. If you want to go out on the internet and Google around and find something else, that's fine too. Pretty much each programmer ends up with his own little bag of tricks for validating email addresses. At this point, we only have one validation left, which is a validation that the email address is unique. Remember, we're going to be using email addresses as unique usernames, and so we should validate that. I should warn you that there is a trick here. The uniqueness validation in Rails doesn't actually guarantee uniqueness, and so make sure to watch through the end of this section, because there's something that will bite you if you don't implement it. So let's write our test for the uniqueness validation. I'm going to close some things down here. we're done with Rubular for now. Thank you, Rubular, again. And let's take a look at this. It's nice sometimes to have this over here, the auto test window, and then TextMate. Good. So let's do it should reject duplicate email addresses. Now, the way we're going to test for this is first to create a user in the database and then make sure that a second user with the same email address is not valid. So let's do user.createBang and just use our attributes hash. And now we're going to make another user using user.new just to make the user in memory and then check that that user is not valid. So it's a user with duplicate email. Now just use the same attributes hash. Now this user with duplicate email should not be valid. Should not be valid. Now we'll save it. Of course, we'll be red at this point because this user is valid. That's the whole point. And now we can switch over to the user model. Now let's put in our uniqueness validation. The way to do this is with uniqueness true. Let's just let's line these guys up. Now I'm going to save it, and it should work. See if it's green. Good. So we're green. Now there's one little detail, and this is the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily run into if you hadn't been doing lots of web development. But one of the problems here is that since we're using a regular expression that's matching valid email addresses, it's letting through email addresses with different case. That is to say, a capitalized email address is the same as a lowercase email address. But if we're going to be finding email addresses in the database, we really want to be able to make sure that they're unique, even if the case is different. So in other words, let's put this in code. Rather than explaining it, let's just write it out. So it should reject email addresses identical up to case. And it'll become clear, I hope, what this means. So I'm going to define an email address that is the same as the attribute email address, that is to say, just user@example.com, except all uppercase. So I can do this. Upcased email. Let's just write it out for now. I'm going to change this in a minute. This is user@example.com. And now this email address is exactly the same as the all lowercase email address in terms of where it gets routed to. And yet right now, our validation won't catch this. In other words, it considers this email address to be different from the all lowercase version. So we want to create a user with this email address. .create bang. Where the email is the upcased email. So now we've created a user in the database with that email address, and now we can make a new user with a duplicate email. User with duplicate email equals user.new, and this is now the original attributes hash. And so you can see the problem here that this should not be valid, but it will be valid right now. This is going to fail because our uniqueness considers this all caps email address to be different from the all lowercase email. And I mentioned that I was going to change this. I just want to show you there's a very simple way to take a string and make the upcase version of it. Let's go over here. So let's do foobar.upcase. You can see that there's a very simple way. So let's just implement that. So it's actually a little bit more abstract, but it really says what we mean. So it should still be red. Good. Now there's a very simple way to do this validation. This is a common problem, and so oftentimes you'll be amazed, at least I am, at how well Rails anticipates your needs as a web developer. So in this case, instead of saying uniqueness true, we can say uniqueness and then give it a hash that says case sensitive is false. Uniqueness being true is now implicit in this. Good, and so there's our green. Let's rerun the test suite just to be double sure. And at this point, our validations are complete. Let's take a look at them again. A user's name has to be present, and it can't be longer than 50 characters. The email address also has to be present, and it has to match a particular regular expression, which we have here. And it has to be unique, and we're even taking the trouble to ignore the case sensitivity. Now, the problem I alluded to is that there's a scenario in which you can actually have two users create identical email addresses. And so I just want to briefly discuss the way that works. Suppose that Alice signs up for our sample application using the address alice@wonderland.com. And suppose furthermore that she accidentally clicks on the submit button twice. This is what you would do in a web form. You might accidentally send two requests in quick succession. And so what can happen is that the first request will create a user in memory that passes validation because there's no email address, alice@wonderland.com in the database. But request 2 can do the same and also have an email address that passes validation. And then both of them can get saved. Now, this actually happened to me in the past, which is how I discovered this issue. I learned the hard way that what you need to do is actually guarantee at the database level that the email is unique. So let's look into this, and we're going to learn something else really useful about databases called database indices. Let's start by understanding the notion of a database index. So this is the index of a book. In a book index, if you want to, say, find all of the pages that talk about, say, the XHR method, this is something a little bit obscure. We'll talk about this later in this tutorial, actually. You can see that XHR method is on pages 502 to 504. Now think about what would be involved in going through this entire book to look for places where the XHR method appears. You would have to go through each page and look to see if the XHR method appears on that page. What a book index does is it tells you all of the pages where that, in this case, the XHR method appears. So a database index is essentially the same idea. So if you think about a long table of users, each with a unique email address, if you needed to find a user by email address, in principle, you would have to go through each record in the table and compare the given email address to the user's email address. So for example, if you wanted to find mhartle@example.com, you would have to look at the first record and say, that user's email address, mhartle@example.com, and if not, then you would have to go on to the next record. In the database biz, this is known as a full table scan, because in principle, you might have to scan through the entire table if the record you're looking for is the last one. The way to avoid this is essentially the same as the solution with books. What you do is, for each email address, you indicate which record it corresponds to. And so this is known as a database index, and so in this section we're going to put an index on the email attribute, because that's the one we're going to be searching by when we log users in later on. So at this point we're going to have to change the database to add an index on the email column of the users table, and that means we're going to need another migration for our database. Let's go back to our terminal. Now, before we made a migration, but it was implicit when we did Rails generate model that automatically created a migration for us. In this case, we only want the migration, so we're going to do Rails generate migration. And now we're going to call it add email uniqueness index. Let's go find that file. It's in db migrate, and now it's the second one. Add email uniqueness index. And the way to do this is to use the add index function in here. Add index users, that's the name of the table, and then we want to add the index to the email column. And this is where the uniqueness comes in. You can require that an index be unique. So we're going to say unique is true. And anytime you have an up migration, you should have a down migration. So let's remove index, user's email. So this completes our migration. What this will do is add this index to our users table. Let's do this. You'll note that I'm not doing test-driven development here. I actually don't know how to test for this. It's the kind of situation that happens so rarely and only in production systems that if anyone out there knows how to write a test for this, let me know, because I'd love to put it in the book. Now that we've made the migration file, we need to actually run the migration. So let's do rake db migrate. And it's a good practice to update the test database, even though it doesn't matter in this case. This is a good habit. Rake db test prepare. And let's just double check that we're still green. Good. Now, you may be wondering at this point, what happens in the scenario I described where the two users were saved with the same email address? And the answer is that the second save will fail, and it will raise an exception. It will raise an active record statement invalid exception. You go ahead and take a look at the Ruby on Rails tutorial book if you want some more details about this. It has a link to some source code that I wrote a while back that represents my actual experience with this problem and its solution. But in short, you can do what's called a rescue. You can rescue from the exception, and then in the case of the application I wrote, it just redirects back to the root URL. But in any case, this is a useful user model, and at this point we are complete for the purposes of this lesson. We'll see in the next lesson how to add a password attribute and deal with some authentication concerns. But for the rest of this lesson, we're going to use this user model, and we're going to make some first steps toward making the profile page that we saw mocked up at the beginning of the lesson. Before moving on, let's make a commit to our version control. So it's here. Let's add everything and say git commit. User model validations, and there we go.